A calm morning at Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary exploded into chaos within seconds when an aging bobcat suddenly broke out of its enclosure and tore through the visitor paths like a living storm. People scattered in panic, alarms screamed overhead, and security raised their tranquilizer rifles. But in the middle of that terror, one elderly woman stood completely still. Her eyes filled not with fear, but with shock, as if she had just seen someone she'd been trying to forget for 19 years. And as the bobcat charged straight toward her, everyone braced for the worst until the truth silenced the entire sanctuary. The morning at Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary had started like any other, quiet, cold, and wrapped in the thin Colorado mist that always lingered over the pines at sunrise. Caretakers were sweeping pathways, volunteers were loading feed carts, and the handful of early visitors wandered slowly as if the park itself were still waking up. No one imagined the peace would split apart in a single breath. At 9:17 a.m., the first alarm detonated through the speakers. Code Silver, Bobcat, escaped enclosure C. All units, lock down Sector 3. Every bird on the trees scattered at once. A coffee cup slipped from someone's hand and shattered. Then the world fell into motion, fast, violent, panicked. Visitors erupted into screams as rangers sprinted across the walkways. The security gates slammed down with metallic thuds, one after another, sealing off paths like a closing maze. Bruno, 19 years old, 46 pounds, arthritic but still powerful, had done something no one believed he was capable of. The old bobcat had broken out. The secondary service gate, normally double-locked, hung lopsided on its hinges, claw marks carved deep into the metal. It shouldn't have been possible. He had never tried anything like that in nearly 2 decades. But today, he wasn't the same Bruno. "You've got to be kidding me," Officer Raymond muttered as he caught sight of the cat's silhouette moving through the brush with an unnervingly determined gait. "He's fast, too fast for his age." A medic shouted into his radio, breathless. "He looks agitated, fur spiked, tail rigid. He's in a full stress response. If he reaches the guests, we have a problem." "Get the tranquilizers ready," someone yelled. The situation escalated instantly. Rangers fanned out with rifles loaded with sedatives. Volunteers ran down the walkways, ushering families behind emergency barriers. Children cried, mothers shook, and phones came out, because even in danger, people always filmed. The commotion spread across the sanctuary like wildfire. But amid all the chaos, the bobcat did something even more alarming. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't hunting. He was moving with purpose. Straight down the main visitor trail, straight toward the crowds, straight toward one specific direction, as if drawn by something only he could sense. "Why isn't he veering off?" Ranger Ellis barked. "Bobcats avoid noise. They don't run into it." Nobody answered. No one had ever seen Bruno behave like this. This was an animal who usually hid from loud noises, who spent most of his days curled under shade, disinterested in anyone except his favorite caretaker. But now his eyes were wide, pupils stretched, breath shallow. He was locked onto a target with fierce, almost desperate focus. Visitors scattered in every direction when they spotted him barreling down the trail. "He's coming this way. Run! Oh God, move, move!" A stroller tipped over in the scramble. Popcorn spilled like confetti. A man tripped over a bench and crawled backward, his voice cracking. Bruno shot past him without even glancing. He didn't care about the noise. He didn't care about people. Not a single ranger could predict the pattern. It was as if the bobcat were chasing a memory. "Sector 1 is compromised," the head of security shouted. "Intersect him at the bridge." But the bridge was already crowded. At the far end of it, a cluster of visitors struggled to escape the surge of bodies shoving toward the exits. And right in the center of the walkway, standing perfectly still while the world fled around her, was an elderly woman in a pale gray coat. She didn't run. She didn't even flinch. Her hand tightened around the handle of her wooden cane, as the noise of the alarm wailed overhead. People bumped her shoulder, shouting for her to move, but she simply blinked, her gaze fixed on the trail ahead. Ranger Ellis caught sight of her and swore, "Why is she still there? Get her out of the way." The woman didn't react. Her name, though no one there knew it yet, was Margaret Maggie Coleman, age 78, a retired nurse, a widow, quiet, private, the sort of elderly woman people overlooked because she carried herself softly, gently, like someone who never wanted to inconvenience the world. But even from a distance, something looked wrong. She wasn't confused. She wasn't frozen in fear. She was listening to something only she could hear. Bruno's shadow burst into view behind the trees, sprinting toward the footbridge with startling speed for a cat of his age. Rangers yelled warnings. Guns were raised. Visitors screamed. The Bobcat locked his gaze on the woman the moment she turned her head toward him. Maggie inhaled sharply, her body trembling. Not from terror, not exactly, but from recognition so sudden it hit her like a blow. Because in that one frozen second, as the frantic world blurred around her, she whispered a name the Rangers never expected to hear from a stranger's lips. Bruno. The sanctuary froze. "What did she say?" Ellis hissed. "She knows the Bobcat?" another ranger asked. Bruno accelerated, ears flattened, legs stretched, claws digging into the wood of the bridge as he propelled himself toward the elderly woman with a force that made onlookers scream. "He's charging her! Take the shot! We don't have a clean angle!" The air tightened. Heartbeats thundered. Visitors filmed with shaking hands. The Rangers braced themselves for the moment no wildlife sanctuary ever wants to face. And Maggie, frail, pale, trembling, did not move an inch. Instead, she whispered again, voice cracking like a memory resurfacing through decades of dust. "My boy." Bruno let out a sound, raw, guttural, heartbreaking, that silenced even the alarms. Somewhere in the chaos, a ranger whispered under his breath, "What, in God's name, is happening?" But no one had the answer yet. No one understood why the old Bobcat wasn't attacking, why he wasn't behaving like a wild animal at all. Yet the truth, the real reason Bruno had burst out of his enclosure, the reason he charged straight at this elderly woman, was about to unfold in a way that would rewrite everything they knew about him, and everything she thought she had buried. Because Bruno wasn't running wild. He was running home. For a moment it felt as if the entire sanctuary forgot how to breathe. The alarms still wailed overhead. Rangers shouted orders. Visitors stumbled over one another in frantic retreat. Yet everything around the elderly woman on the bridge seemed to fall into a strange, suspended quiet. The world moved, but she did not. She stood alone in the center of the walkway, her gray coat trembling in the morning breeze, her wooden cane pressed firmly to the ground, as though anchoring her to a place she refused to leave. Maggie Coleman did not look like someone facing down a charging Bobcat. She didn't even seem to notice the chaos swallowing Pine Ridge. Her eyes, pale blue and tired from age, were fixed on the trail where the animal had appeared. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but her posture never shifted. To anyone watching, it was as if her mind had left the present moment entirely and stepped into a memory only she could see. Ranger Ellis sprinted toward her, waving his arms and shouting, "Ma'am, move! You need to move right now!" His voice cracked with panic. He could see Bruno gaining speed again, the bridge rattling under his paws with each heavy stride. But Maggie didn't turn, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge him. "Why isn't she reacting?" a young volunteer cried. "Is she in shock?" "It's not shock," Ellis muttered under his breath. "It's something else." Her calmness unsettled everyone around her. Panic made sense. Stillness did not. Not with a wild Bobcat sprinting down the walkway, acting more erratic than they'd ever seen him. The scene would have been terrifying from any angle, especially for the elderly. Videos online about wildlife safety, animal rescue practices, conservation rules, wildlife behavior always emphasized one thing: distance saves lives. And yet here she was, standing her ground, though she had been expecting this all along. A group of teenagers huddled beside the railing, phones raised, whispering frantically. "Is she crazy?" one asked, voice shaking. "She's going to get herself killed." Another girl shook her head. "Look at her face. She's not scared. She looks like she knows him." That was the part everyone felt but couldn't explain. There was something familiar, almost tender, about the way Maggie's eyes locked onto Bruno as he approached. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Maggie tightened her grip on her cane, knuckles whitening. The name she had whispered, Bruno, still lingered in the space around her, hanging there with a weight the Rangers could not yet understand. Her lips trembled slightly, as though more words were trapped behind them, desperate to surface. A gust of wind pushed through the pines, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin, dust, and something else, something that made Maggie's breath stutter, a scent she hadn't smelled in nearly 2 decades. Her heart lurched painfully in her chest. "Ma'am, please," Ellis shouted again, stepping in front of her. "We need to get you to safety. He's coming at full speed." Only then did she slowly turn her head toward him. It was not the sluggish turn of an elderly woman overwhelmed by fear. It was deliberate, steady, and strangely sad. Her eyes met his, and Ellis felt a heaviness there that made his words catch in his throat. "I can't move," she whispered softly. Ellis blinked, stunned. You can't? Why, are you injured?" She shook her head. "No, I just can't." Her voice carried a quiet certainty that unsettled him more than the charging bobcat. Something about the way she said it made him hesitate. She wasn't frozen by fear. She was rooted by something deeper, something he didn't understand. Behind them, Bruno tore through the last stretch of trail, his breath harsh and uneven. His hind legs shook slightly with age, but it didn't slow him. He kept pushing forward, pushing past pain, driven by an instinct that felt almost human. Ethan Cole skidded to a stop on the far end of the bridge, raising both hands to signal the Rangers behind him to hold fire. "Wait!" Ethan yelled. "Don't take the shot!" "You can't be serious!" another Ranger snapped. "He's charging her." "I know, but look at him," Ethan shouted back. "He's not going for an attack stance. This is different. Look at his posture." Ellis glanced back at Bruno, his eyes narrowing. The bobcat ran hard, but there was no snarl, no bared teeth, no low guttural threat. His ears weren't pinned fully back in aggression. They were angled, flicking forward, as if listening for something. His eyes were wide, not with rage, but with a kind of desperation that clawed its way into Ellis's chest. "He's not hunting her," Ellis murmured. "Then what is he doing?" Maggie heard none of the shouting. The world around her grew muffled, the alarms thinning into a distant hum as her mind fought to keep hold of reality. Her knees quivered, not from the fear pressing around her, but from the weight of a truth she had buried so deeply she believed it had died inside her. Her whisper cracked the air again, barely audible. "It can't be, after all this time." A bystander nearby whispered, "Did she just say, 'after all this time'? What does she mean?" No one had the answer yet. Bruno's paws thundered across the wooden planks of the bridge. He was close now, too close. Visitors screamed from behind the barricades. A baby cried. Someone dropped a phone. Another Ranger raised his tranquilizer gun again, unable to watch what looked like an inevitable tragedy unfold. And still, Maggie did not move. Her eyes glistened, tears forming against her will. The way Bruno moved was different from the way wild animals normally behaved in distress or agitation. There was something almost heartbreakingly familiar in the rhythm of his strides. Her chest clenched. She pressed a trembling hand over her heart. She knew. On some deep, wordless level, she knew. Bruno was not charging a stranger. He was charging toward something he had been missing for 19 long years. The distance closed in a heartbeat. 10 feet, 8, 5. "Ma'am," Ellis shouted, reaching for her arm. "Please." But before he could touch her, Maggie finally lifted her chin. Her voice came out fractured, filled with a kind of trembling ache that silenced even the nearest screams. "My boy? Is that really you?" Bruno let out a sound so raw, so unlike the fierce cry of a hunting bobcat, that even the alarm seemed to quiet for a breath. The rangers froze. Ethan's eyes went wide. Visitors stopped screaming mid-breath. It was not a roar. It was not a growl. It was a broken, trembling call, a sound of recognition, a sound no one expected a wild bobcat to make. And in that impossible moment, as the elderly woman stared at the charging creature with tears streaking down her cheeks, the entire sanctuary watched something they could not explain. A predator closing the distance, not with violence, but with memory. The old bobcat was running to her, not to strike, not to harm, but because somehow, against every rule of logic, nature, and wildlife science, he remembered her. And the knowledge of it brought Maggie to her knees. For a long, trembling moment, Maggie could not hear anything, not the screams, not the pounding boots of the rangers, not even the frantic warnings echoing through the sanctuary's loudspeakers. The world had narrowed into a single, impossible sight, the old bobcat barreling toward her with a force that should have terrified her. But instead of fear, an ache spread through her chest, one she hadn't felt in nearly 2 decades. Bruno. The name pulsed in her mind, as familiar as her own heartbeat. It was impossible, absurd, and yet the moment she spoke it aloud, something in her soul shifted. Like a door she thought she had locked forever creaked open again. Her breath caught, sharp and painful, as if the cold Colorado air had turned to glass in her lungs. Ranger Ellis grabbed her arm, desperate now. "Ma'am, please, you have to move. He's going to—" But Maggie couldn't move. Her legs simply would not obey. They buzzed with a numbness so complete it frightened her. Yet the fear wasn't for herself. It was for what the truth might mean, for the memory sprinting toward her in the shape of an old, desperate animal. "He heard me," she whispered, though no one was close enough to understand it. "God help me. He heard me." The trembling in her hands grew worse. She pressed her palm to her cane to steady herself, but even the wood seemed to shake beneath her grip. Her mind, fragile but stubborn, ripped itself backward, back through years she thought had dulled, back through winters and hospital rooms and nights spent alone, until it reached the image she had buried so deeply she no longer dared to think of it. A blizzard, a tiny shivering body, a pair of eyes too big for the world, and her voice, 20 years younger, soft and reassuring. "It's all right, little one. You're safe now." The sound of paws striking the bridge finally forced her eyes open again. Bruno was close, too close, and yet something in his gait struck her with a force stronger than fear. His shoulders were hunched, not in aggression, but in strain. The way he leaned forward brought back memories of the little bobcat she had found in the Montana snow, his leg mangled by an illegal trap, his breath weak, body trembling against the cold. "Bruno," she whispered again, her lips trembling as the years collapsed, and the bobcat slowed. It was so subtle that the rangers didn't notice at first, but Maggie saw it, the shift in his weight, the sudden hesitation in his steps, the way his ears tilted, not backward in aggression, but toward her, catching the sound of her voice. Ethan Cole, breathless from sprinting across the sanctuary, finally reached the far side of the bridge. He skidded to a stop, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "No way," he whispered. "He's responding to her?" Ranger Jackson, aiming his tranquilizer rifle, muttered, "This doesn't make sense. Bruno doesn't connect with strangers." But Maggie was no stranger, not to this Bobcat, not to the life she once saved. Her chest tightened again, a sharp stabbing pain that made her sway. She gripped the railing with her free hand, praying the pain wouldn't buckle her knees. She didn't want the Rangers to see. She didn't want anyone to know the truth stamped inside the hospital wristband hidden beneath her sleeve. Not yet. Not before she knew for sure. The name Bruno echoed through her mind again, louder now, unraveling the years as if they had never passed at all. She could still remember the first time she whispered it to him, years before animal control laws, conservation guidelines, or pet insurance policies ever mattered to her. Back then it was only about survival, his and maybe hers, too. Her eyes burned as the images returned. Montana, 19 years ago. She had been driving home through the tail end of a storm when she saw something in the snowbank, a small, curled shape, barely moving. At first she thought it was a rabbit, but when she stepped into the wind and bent down, she saw the pointed ears, the tufted cheeks, the fragile body riddled with cuts and frostbite. A bobcat kitten, barely alive. She remembered scooping him up, wrapping him inside her coat, whispering to him all the way home as he whimpered weakly, "You're going to make it, I promise." She had named him Bruno the next morning after the saint her late mother used to pray to, Saint Bruno, protector of the forgotten. The name always felt right. And now here he was, charging toward her, as if answering a call she never meant to send. "Ma'am, please step back." Ethan's voice boomed from the other side of the bridge. "Bruno is still a wild animal." But Maggie barely heard him. Tears blurred her vision. Her heart pounded painfully, too fast, too hard, reminding her of the diagnosis she had received only weeks ago. Congestive heart failure, late stage. The kind of diagnosis that made doctors speak softly and family members touch your hand more often. But none of it mattered now, not compared to the sight of the animal she had loved like family. Bruno closed the distance. 12 feet, 10, 8. Visitors gasped. Rangers shouted. Someone screamed. But Maggie only whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice underfoot, "I'm so sorry." The bobcat dipped his head abruptly, catching a scent in the air, a scent he knew, one woven into the deepest part of him. The same scent that had once meant warmth, food, safety. A scent tied to long nights by the fireplace, to the gentle hum of lullabies, to hands that bandaged his wounds and stroked his fur when he trembled in fear. His stride faltered, his pupils widened. He remembered. The realization hit Maggie like a blow. She sank to her knees, unable to hold herself upright under the weight of 19 years of guilt, grief, and longing. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "my sweet boy." Something broke in the air around them, an invisible crack between danger and recognition, and everyone watching felt it, even if they didn't understand it yet. Bruno slowed further, head lowering as if unsure whether the world around him was real. Ethan watched in astonishment. "He knows her? How?" Jackson asked, stunned. "Bobcats don't have that kind of long-term memory." But Maggie heard him, and the pain on her face was a confession all its own, because she knew exactly how. The years had not erased her from the Bobcat's heart, nor had they erased him from hers, and as she reached out a trembling hand toward him, tears streaking down her weathered cheeks, the truth hit her with a force that stole what little breath she had left. Bruno hadn't run wild. He had run home. The wooden planks of the bridge vibrated under Bruno's weight as he bounded forward, each paw striking the surface with a force that echoed across the sanctuary. Visitors fled toward the exits, some screaming, some crying, others frozen halfway between terror and awe as they watched the old bobcat charge toward the elderly woman who still hadn't taken a single step away from danger. The alarms overhead continued to blare, but even their harsh metallic tone seemed distant compared to the pounding rhythm of Bruno's approach. Ethan Cole sprinted along the opposite side of the bridge, boots thundering, lungs burning from the cold morning air. "Don't shoot!" he yelled again, cutting in front of Ranger Jackson's line of fire. "Hold your fire! Do you hear me?" Jackson swore under his breath, finger trembling over the trigger. "He's going straight at her, Ethan. If he hits her—" "He won't," Ethan said, though he wasn't certain enough to believe it. Still, something deep in his gut told him to trust what he saw. Bruno's posture wasn't the posture of a predator in full attack mode. There was something desperate, almost panicked, in the way the bobcat ran. It reminded him of animals searching for something they feared they'd lost forever. The signs were there, shoulders tight, tail low, head bobbing with confusion instead of aggression. But the Rangers didn't see that. The crowd didn't see that. All they saw was a large, powerful wild animal racing toward a frail woman who could barely stand. Ellis rushed toward Maggie again, nearly stumbling as he closed the distance. "Ma'am, please, you have to move," he cried, reaching for her arm. Maggie barely heard him. Her knees shook, her eyes locked on the bobcat with a mix of fear, disbelief, and something else, something Ellis couldn't understand. She pressed one hand to her chest, as if trying to steady her heart, which hammered painfully beneath her ribs. The hospital wristband hidden under her sleeve dug into her skin, but she didn't care. Nothing mattered except the memory thundering toward her on 4 shaking legs. "I can't move," she whispered again, her voice cracking. "I can't." Ellis froze. There was something in her tone, something breaking, that made him step back. She wasn't stubborn. She wasn't confused. She was overwhelmed by something he couldn't see. Bruno surged forward again, closing the distance, 15 feet, 12, 10. His breath came in ragged bursts, visible in clouds of white in the cold morning air. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring, as he caught the scent he had chased through the wind. Recognition flickered in his movements. His stride changed, just a fraction, but enough for someone who knew animals well to notice. "Look at his tail," Ethan shouted, chest heaving. "It's low. He's conflicted. He's not fully in attack mode." "Conflicted animals are dangerous," Jackson snapped. "Let me shoot." "No," Ethan barked. "You fire that dart and you might hit her instead, or it'll trigger him. Stand down." The hesitation rippled across the team. The tension was razor thin. Even the visitors watching from behind the barricades felt the air tighten with fear. Some filmed with shaking hands, muttering about wildlife attacks and animal behavior, their voices trembling with uncertainty. But Maggie heard none of it. She saw only the bobcat whose life had once depended on her hands. The tiny creature she had wrapped in towels and fed warm milk to through sleepless nights. The small body she held close during storms. The kitten that had once meowed in fear every time she stepped out of the room. Her chest squeezed painfully, and she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "Bruno, sweetheart, what are you doing?" The bobcat darted left for a moment, then sharply right, unsure of how to approach. It was a movement she recognized instantly, the same uncertain zigzag he used to make when he was frightened, but trying to appear brave. Her heart lurched at the familiarity. Her throat tightened as the years fell away. Bruno slowed just slightly, 8 feet now, paws skidding on the wooden planks, claws clicking sharply as he fought for balance. He was too old for this kind of sprinting, too weak, but he pushed through it as though something greater than instinct drove him. And then, without warning, he lunged forward again. The crowd screamed. Maggie's eyes widened. Ellis reached out to grab her, but he was too far. Bruno leapt, body arcing through the air, landing just 3 feet from Maggie with a force that made the bridge tremble. His fur bristled, ears flattened, but not in anger. His breathing was frantic. His pupils were huge, not with hunger, but with fear. People watching from the barricades sucked in sharp breaths, waiting for teeth and claws. Instead, Bruno froze. His nose lifted, his head tilted, and a tiny, broken sound slipped from his throat. A sound nobody expected from a creature like him. Ethan's breath hitched. Is he whining? Jackson lowered his gun slightly. No way, bobcats don't. But he did, because he remembered her. Bruno stepped forward, slow, hesitant. His body trembled in a way no one had seen from him before, not even during medical treatments or storms that rattled the sanctuary. He walked as though unsure if the ground beneath him was real. Maggie's breath stuttered. She raised a trembling hand, not to shield herself, but to reach out to him. "It's you," she whispered, voice cracking. "My boy, it's really you." The bobcat blinked slowly. His shoulders sagged. Tail swept once across the boards, then stopped. Another sound escaped him, a soft, rasping chirp, the kind bobcats only ever make when they feel safe. The sanctuary fell silent. For the first time since the alarm sounded, nobody screamed. Nobody moved. Even the alarm seemed muted compared to the fragile moment unfolding in front of them. A visitor whispered, "He knows her." Another muttered, "How is this even possible?" Ellis backed up slowly. "Ethan, you seeing this?" "I'm seeing it," Ethan murmured, awestruck. "I've been studying animal behavior for years. I've never seen anything like this." Bruno inched closer. Maggie choked on a sob. Her hand hovered in the cold air, shaking. And then, softly, hesitantly, the old bobcat pressed his head against her knees. The bridge fell into complete silence. Every ranger lowered their gun. Every witness held their breath. And Maggie, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, whispered the truth that had finally broken through 19 years of fear and guilt. "You came back for me." Bruno leaned harder into her legs, trembling with exhaustion and emotion as only an animal who remembered too much could tremble. He hadn't charged to attack. He hadn't escaped to harm anyone. He had been running toward the only person who ever saved him, the only home he had ever known. For several seconds, no one moved. The entire sanctuary seemed suspended between breaths, caught in a silence so heavy it pressed against the skin. The alarms were still blaring, the radio still crackling with frantic voices, but none of it seemed to touch the old wooden bridge where an elderly woman and an aging bobcat faced one another as if the rest of the world no longer existed. Bruno's forehead remained pressed gently against Maggie's knees, not with the force of a wild animal claiming territory, but with the trembling hesitation of a creature reaching for something it had lost long ago. His whiskers quivered. His breath came out in fragile puffs, warming the fabric of her coat. His tail lay slack behind him, not stiff with fear or aggression, but loose, almost submissive. Ranger Ellis felt his throat tighten. God Almighty, he knows her. Ethan stood a few feet away, still frozen in stunned disbelief. "This isn't possible," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. "Bobcats don't form long-term attachments like this, not after 19 years. But the evidence was right before them. Bruno leaned his weight into Maggie with a familiarity too intentional, too emotional, to be dismissed as coincidence. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. True, unmistakable recognition. Maggie lifted one trembling hand and placed it on the top of his head. The moment her fingers sank into his scruffy fur, the bobcat let out a soft, rasping chuff. The same sound he used to make as a kitten when she rocked him beside the fireplace during the Montana Soartiet. Winters, Tears welled in her eyes and spilled freely, rolling down the deep lines of her cheeks. "Oh, darling," she whispered, voice cracking. "I thought you'd forgotten me, Des." Bruno closed his eyes, leaning his head harder against her touch. His body trembled, not from cold, but from emotion so raw it startled even the seasoned rangers who had worked with big cats their entire careers. The visitors watching from behind the railings lowered their phones slowly. Many, too, moved to speak. A mother hugged her child closer. An elderly man removed his cap and held it against his chest. Something sacred was happening, and no one wanted to interrupt it. Behind Maggie, Ranger Jackson finally lowered his tranquilizer rifle all the way. His shoulders sagged with both relief and disbelief. "I've never seen that in my life," he muttered. "Never from a bobcat. Never from any wildcat, honestly." Ethan stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle either of them. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I need to know. How does he know you?" Maggie couldn't answer at first. She kept stroking Bruno's head, fingers shaking from the strain of holding herself upright. The bobcat shifted slightly, sensing her weakness, and moved closer, pressing his body along her shins as if trying to steady her. "He remembers," she whispered, barely audible. "After everything, he remembers." Ethan crouched near them, but not too close. His training in wildlife behavior, something he had spent years studying through both experience and scientific research, told him to watch Bruno's rhythm, the pattern of his breathing, the subtle changes in posture. The bobcat's muscles were tense, but not predatory. He was trembling from exertion, from age, from emotion. Ethan's heartbeat slowed as he realized the truth. "He ran to find you." The phrase spread through the small group like a shockwave. Maggie's tears fell faster. "I didn't think he would. I didn't think I mattered anymore." Bruno lifted his head and made a soft vocalization, half chirp, half breath, before brushing the side of his face against her hand, marking her with the scent glands on his cheeks, the way he used to do when he was small enough to curl inside a shoebox. It was a gesture of trust, of belonging, of identity, an act wild animals rarely offered to humans unless there was a bond deeper than instinct. Visitors whispered from behind the barricades, "He's hugging her." "I didn't know bobcats did that." "She must have raised him." "This is unreal." One woman, voice shaking, said, "This should be on Animal Planet or National Geographic. People need to see this." Ethan swallowed hard, still kneeling. "Ma'am, you know him. I can see that. And he knows you. But for everyone's safety, I need you to tell me how." Maggie finally turned her head toward him. Her eyes were red, glistening, hollowed by grief and guilt. "I raised him," she whispered, "when he was just a few weeks old. He was barely alive when I found him." Ethan's jaw slackened. "You raised a bobcat?" 19 years ago, she said softly. "In Montana." Her fingers curled slightly as memories she'd tried to suppress resurfaced like ghosts. "He was caught in a trap. Half frozen. I couldn't leave him. I fed him, kept him warm, nursed him every night. For nearly a year." Her voice faltered, the weight of the past dragging at her breath. "And then," she continued, "I had to let him go. They took him to a conservation center. They told me he'd have a better life, and I believed them. I wanted to visit. I planned to. But then my husband got sick." She touched her chest, pressing her palm to her sternum as if steadying her failing heart. "And then I got sick." Bruno nudged her again, as if feeling the pain beneath her words. Maggie stroked his cheek, her touch tender and hesitant. "I never went back," she whispered. I thought he'd forget me." The silence around them thickened. Even the alarms seemed softer now, as if respectful. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Ma'am, he didn't forget." Bruno pressed his forehead to her hand once more, the gesture unmistakably gentle. Maggie sobbed, shoulders shaking. and for a moment it looked as though her frail frame might collapse entirely. The bobcat sensed it and positioned himself closer, bracing his body against her legs, steadying her like he somehow understood she needed the support. Ellis stepped forward, speaking quietly to Ethan. "We need to move them off the bridge. It's not safe here. But how do we separate them without hurting either one?" Ethan shook his head. "We don't. Not right now. If we try, Bruno might panic. We need to get them to the vet center together." "Together?" Jackson asked, incredulous. Ethan nodded. "He won't leave her, and forcing him will only escalate things." Jackson stared at Bruno, the once wild, once distant bobcat, leaning against an elderly woman like a long-lost child seeking comfort. "My God," he whispered, "he looks like he's afraid to lose her again." Maggie's breathing hitched. She leaned down slightly, her voice breaking into a whisper, meant only for the animal pressed against her. "I'm here, sweetheart," she murmured. "I'm right here." Bruno's tail swept once across the wooden planks, a soft, slow gesture of calm. She wrapped both hands around his head, holding him close as tears slipped freely down her cheeks. "You remembered," she whispered. "After all these years, you remembered." And this time, no one questioned the impossible, because it was no longer impossible. It was undeniable. The bond between a dying woman and the wild creature she had once saved had not been erased by time, disease, or distance. It had simply waited, quietly, painfully, until this moment. The walk from Pandanian. The bridge to the veterinary center should have taken less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Rangers moved cautiously, forming a protective circle around Maggie and Bruno as they walked, though walked wasn't quite the right word. Maggie shuffled slowly, leaning heavily on her cane, and Bruno stayed glued to her side, matching her movements inch by inch. His shoulder brushed her leg with every step, as though he feared she might disappear if he let even an inch of space come between them. No one dared to interrupt the strange procession. Visitors watched from a distance, hushed and trembling, unable to reconcile what their eyes were seeing. A wild bobcat, once regarded as unpredictable, territorial, a creature of instinct, now walking like a loyal companion beside a frail elderly woman. Even the staff members who had worked with Bruno for years whispered among themselves, stunned. Ethan walked closest behind them, hands ready but movements gentle, as though afraid that a sudden gesture might break the fragile peace Bruno had wrapped himself in. He kept speaking softly through his radio to Dr. Lauren Reyes, the sanctuary's head veterinarian, giving her updates in a quiet, breathless voice. "Dr. Reyes, he's not showing aggression. It's something else. You need to see it, to believe it." Her reply crackled through the line. "I'm prepping the observation room. I want eyes on both of them immediately. And Ethan, stay calm. We need to control the environment." "I know," he whispered, "but I think they're controlling it more than we are." As they reached the path leading to the medical wing, Maggie staggered slightly, her grip tightening on her cane. Bruno stopped instantly, ears twitching as he glanced up at her. His body leaned gently into her hip, a silent question in his posture. "Are you all right?" She nodded weakly, though her pallor told a different story. The soft winter sun caught the sheen of sweat on her temples. Her breath was short, uneven, and her hand trembled violently on the cane's handle. "Let's get her inside," Ethan urged. "I'm fine," Maggie murmured, though her voice was barely audible. "Just a moment." But she wasn't fine, and he knew it. The sanctuary's emergency protocols for human health, something they rarely needed, flickered through his mind. Senior health emergencies, heart complications, dehydration, shock. His years working in wildlife rescue and environmental medicine taught him to read signs not just in animals, but in people too. She was struggling. And she wasn't hiding it as well as she thought. Bruno moved closer still, his body brushing hers. It was not dominance. It was not territoriality. It was support. Like he remembered her fragility. Like he remembered the way she used to lower herself to the floor beside the fireplace, wrapping him in blankets and resting his tiny head on her lap. "Almost there," Ethan said. "Gently. Just a few more feet." But Maggie didn't answer. She lifted her wrist instead, pressing lightly on her sleeve as if something underneath was irritating her. Her fingers curled around the edge of the fabric, tugging it down instinctively when she noticed Ethan watching. He recognized the gesture immediately. The partially hidden hospital wristband, the soft imprint of plastic, the kind used for patients in long-term cardiac monitoring. His heart dropped. He waited until they reached the double doors of the veterinary center before he spoke again. Quiet, careful, respectful. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I need to ask you something important." She didn't look at him. Instead, she stared at the glass doors, her shoulders sagging under the weight of exhaustion. Bruno pressed against her side, watching her face with wide, unblinking eyes. "What is it?" she murmured. "I saw the bracelet," Ethan said. "Your wristband. That's from a hospital, isn't it?" Her fingers stiffened around the cane. He continued, gentler still. "You're sick. Very sick." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Maggie closed her eyes, shoulders trembling with a quiet resignation that made Ethan's chest ache. After a long moment, she exhaled shakily. "No sense hiding it now," she whispered. "Yes, I'm sick." "How sick?" Ethan asked, already fearing the answer. She hesitated. Bruno nudged her again, almost as if urging her to speak. "Stage 4 heart failure," she said softly. "Congestive. My doctor told me. Months, maybe less." Ethan's breath caught. "And you came here anyway?" "I had to," she said. "I didn't know he was still alive. But something in me couldn't leave this world without trying to find him one last time." Her voice broke on the last words. Bruno's ears tilted as if he understood the ache in her tone. He stepped in front of her, looking up at her with a kind of urgency. His pupils wide, his whiskers forward. His tail brushed her calf, slow and deliberate. "He feels it," she whispered. "He always did, even as a kitten." Ethan swallowed hard, humbled by the impossibility of what he was witnessing. "And him?" he asked quietly. "Bruno, he's been sick too." Maggie's eyes snapped up. "Sick?" Ethan nodded. "We've been monitoring his kidneys. They're failing. It's age-related. He's nearing the end of his life, too." Her face crumpled. It was as if the truth had been waiting for this moment, waiting to align their paths again, two fading lives drawn together as though by invisible string. Bruno made a soft, broken sound and leaned so heavily against her that Ethan instinctively stepped forward, fearing she might fall. But Maggie steadied herself, resting her free hand on the bobcat's head, stroking him gently. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "I'm so sorry I didn't know." Ethan stepped back, giving them space. "Dr. Reyes is ready for both of you," he said quietly. "But she's not going to separate you, not if what we're witnessing is real." "It's real," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "Everything you're seeing, it's real." Inside the veterinary center, the lights were warm, soft, welcoming, designed to calm frightened animals. A leather chair sat beside a padded observation mat on the floor. Medical equipment sat quietly behind curtains, intentionally out of sight. The room had become something else entirely, part clinic, part sanctuary. Dr. Lauren Reyes waited inside, her usually stern expression cracked open with something between awe and disbelief. She approached slowly, careful not to disrupt the quiet connection between woman and Bobcat. "Mrs. Coleman, "We'll take care of both of you," she said gently, "but we need to keep you comfortable and him calm." Maggie nodded. Bruno followed her into the room without hesitation, brushing past Dr. Reyes without a single sign of distress. The staff exchanged stunned glances. He had never behaved like this. Not for anyone. Once inside, Maggie lowered herself into the chair with effort, her breath unsteady. The moment she sat, Bruno circled once, then folded himself at her feet, resting his head against her leg like he was returning to an old, familiar role. Dr. Reyes whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. Not in wildlife rehabilitation, not in animal behavior studies, not anywhere." Ethan nodded slowly. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than instinct." Maggie stroked the top of Bruno's head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "It's love," she whispered. Simple as that. Bruno looked up at her, blinking slowly in a way only a creature who trusts completely would do. And Ethan realized something. This wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of the end, for both of them. Two lives nearing their final chapters. Two hearts long separated by circumstance and time. Two souls who had found their way back to each other just when they needed it most. And none of them, not Ethan, not Dr. Reyes, not the sanctuary, could deny the truth any longer. They needed each other now more than ever. The days that followed moved slowly, like time itself had softened its pace to allow two fading lives the chance to settle their unfinished story. The staff at Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary adjusted their schedules, tiptoed around the veterinary wing, and spoke in hushed tones, as if the building held something sacred, something fragile, something they feared might shatter if handled too roughly. Inside the private observation room, Maggie Coleman and Bruno spent their hours together in a quiet rhythm that felt older than the sanctuary itself. Maggie sat in the padded recliner Dr. Reyes had arranged for her, bundled in a soft fleece blanket. Bruno lay curled at her feet most of the time, his head resting gently across her. Shu, his breathing slow and deep, like he had finally found a place where his body could rest after years of resisting the world. Whenever she shifted, even slightly, Bruno raised his head as if making sure she was still there. His ears twitched at the sound of her breath. His eyes softened when she reached down to stroke him. And each time her hand touched his fur, he leaned into her palm with the same quiet longing he had shown as a kitten on those long winter nights in Montana. Maggie would often whisper to him, her voice thin and breathy. "You always were my brave boy," she said on one of those mornings, her fingers moving gently behind his ear, the place he always loved to be scratched. "You held on even when the odds weren't kind to you." Bruno responded with a soft chuff, the gentle sound vibrating through his frail body. He blinked slowly, a gesture of absolute trust. Even the veterinarians who spent decades studying animal behavior could not deny what they saw. It wasn't hunger, fear, or instinct driving him. It was connection. It was memory. It was love. Dr. Lauren Reyes stood behind the observation window often, her eyes glossy, her clipboard forgotten at her side. She knew the data, knew the biology, the research, the limits of cognitive memory in wild animals. She knew the science, but what she didn't know was how to explain this. How to explain the way Bruno's blood pressure stabilized when Maggie spoke. How to explain the lowered stress hormones. How to explain the way his failing kidneys seemed to trouble him less when she stroked his fur. "It's like she's his medicine," Dr. Reyes whispered to Ethan during one of their quiet discussions. "I can't even begin to make sense of it." Ethan nodded slowly, watching the scene through the glass. Some things aren't meant to be explained. This might be one of them. At noon each day, volunteers brought lunch trays for Maggie. Small meals, rich in nutrients because the doctors said she needed strength. She ate only a little. Her appetite waned with each passing sunrise. Still, she insisted on staying every hour the sanctuary allowed her. She refused to let Bruno be alone. They told her she could rest at home, that she could visit the next day. But she shook her head each time. "I won't waste the time we have left," she said. One night, after the visitors had gone home and the sanctuary fell quiet under a blanket of stars, Maggie asked Ethan for a favor. "Would you sit with us a while?" she asked in a frail voice. "It helps, knowing someone is here." Ethan pulled a chair to the doorway, keeping a respectful distance. "Of course," he said softly, "whatever you need." She smiled gently. "You remind me of my husband. When he was younger, he had that same kindness." Her eyes drifted to Bruno at her feet. He loved animals, too, always said caring for them taught him patience. Bruno shifted, folding himself closer to her legs. Ethan noticed his breath was slower than before, shallower. Age was catching up to him quickly now, no longer hidden behind adrenaline or instinct. Maggie lowered her hand again, her fingers brushing his cheek. "We're all nearing the end of our journeys, aren't we, Bruno?" she whispered. "You, me, both of us." Bruno made a soft whimper in response, the smallest sound, but one that pierced Ethan's heart. The old bobcat rested his head back down, eyes drifting closed. "You were his whole world once," Ethan said quietly. "I think you still are." She swallowed hard. "And he was mine. Losing him nearly broke me." "You didn't lose him," Ethan replied gently. "Life pulled you apart. But look where he came the moment he had the chance." She nodded, tears gathering in the creases of her eyes. He came home. The following days brought more signs that both of them were weakening. Maggie's hands shook more. Her breath shortened. Some mornings she struggled to keep her eyes open, drifting into sleep mid-sentence. Dr. Reyes adjusted her medications carefully, trying to ease the strain without causing drowsiness. But heart failure demanded its price. Bruno, too, began to falter. His legs stiffened, his appetite dwindled, his once powerful muscles trembled, even when he only stood for a moment. But no matter how tired he grew, he never left Maggie's side. He stayed as close to her as his body allowed, sometimes lifting his head with effort just to look at her, as though checking she was still breathing. "Animals know," Dr. Reyes murmured one afternoon while watching them through the window. "They know when death is near." Ethan nodded. He's waiting for her, and she's waiting for him. Volunteers began leaving small notes outside the door, messages of love, of prayer, of gratitude. Some visitors asked if they could light candles at the entrance. Others donated to wildlife rehabilitation programs, saying the bond they witnessed inspired them to help other animals in need. Maggie's story, though kept private from the media, rippled through the sanctuary community with a force stronger than any wildlife conservation campaign. Late one evening, while the sky outside dimmed into shades of purple and blue, Maggie opened her eyes and looked down at Bruno, who lay curled but alert at her feet. "You remember everything, don't you?" she whispered. "The nights by the fire, the storms, the milk bottle, the songs I used to hum. You remember my hands, my voice, my scent." Bruno blinked slowly. "And I remember you," she said, her voice breaking. "I remember how small you were, how scared, how brave. I promised I would come back. I failed that promise. I'm so sorry." Bruno pressed his head against her leg, eyes soft, as though forgiving her with a gesture more eloquent than words. Maggie's breath shook. "Thank you for remembering me." Outside the room, Ethan wiped it, his eyes. Dr. Reyes turned away, unable to watch any longer without breaking. Because they knew. Everyone knew. They were witnessing a farewell disguised as a reunion. A closing chapter written by fate, by love, or by something deeper than biology. And as the night deepened, wrapping the sanctuary in quiet, Maggie leaned back in her chair, her hand resting gently on Bruno's head. "We're together," she whispered, "for as long as the good Lord allows." And Bruno, tired and aching, answered her with a soft chuff, a sound of comfort, of belonging, of peace. He would not leave her side. Not now, not ever. Dawn crept slowly across the mountains that bordered Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, painting the sky in muted shades of pink and pale gold. The early light slipped gently through the blinds of the veterinary room, touching the edges of the chair where Maggie rested, and the soft fur of the old bobcat curled faithfully at her feet. The world outside began to stir, keepers prepping feed carts, volunteers arriving for their morning shifts, but inside this quiet room, time held its breath. Maggie's breathing had grown weaker overnight. Even the shallow rise and fall of her chest seemed like effort. Dr. Reyes had sat with her for part of the night, adjusting her oxygen lightly, making sure she felt no pain, offering whispered reassurances that Maggie was barely awake enough to hear. But Bruno had understood. He stayed pressed against her legs, refusing food, refusing rest, refusing to move even when his joints stiffened painfully beneath his aging frame. He sensed it. Everyone did. When Ethan entered the room just after sunrise, he paused at the doorway, struck by the stillness that greeted him. Maggie's eyes were open, not wide, but soft, as though she were watching something beyond the room, something only she could see. Bruno lifted his head at Ethan's arrival, his gaze weary but alert, as if making sure no one would take her away from him. "Good morning, Mrs. Coleman," Ethan murmured, his voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" Maggie smiled faintly, a ghost of the bright smiles she once had. "Tired," she whispered, "but grateful." Her hand moved slowly, brushing the top of Bruno's head. "He stayed with me," she said softly, "all night." "He always will," Ethan replied. A tremor passed through Maggie's hand, and she pressed it lightly against her chest as she gathered her breath. "Ethan, would you do something for me? Anything." She nodded gently toward the floor. "Help me. Get down there. I want to be beside him." Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure? It'll be hard on your body." A spark of determination, fragile but fierce, lit in her tired eyes. "He found his way to me at the end," she said softly. "I want to be there for him at mine." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. With slow, careful movements, he lowered her from the chair, supporting her weight with both arms. Her legs trembled dangerously, but she didn't waver. She reached the padded mat and eased herself down beside Bruno, her breath thin but peaceful. The bobcat shifted immediately, pressing his warm body against her side, his head tucking itself under her hand as though returning to the place he remembered from long ago. Maggie pressed her cheek to the top of his head. "There you are," she whispered, "my brave boy." The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that seemed to hold the world steady. Ethan stepped back toward the door, emotion tightening his throat. Dr. Reyes joined him, her eyes already wet, her hands clasped tightly as she watched the final moments unfold. "They're both at the end," she whispered. "I've seen animals in hospice care before, but never like this." Ethan nodded. He's comforting her, and she's comforting him. Hours passed. Maggie drifted in and out of sleep, her hand never leaving Bruno's fur. Occasionally she whispered to him, fragments of lullabies, memories of Montana snowstorms, gentle hums that trembled with the weight of all the years they lost. Bruno answered each sound with a soft chuff or a faint rumble deep in his chest, like he knew her voice was the last sound he wanted to remember. By early afternoon, her breathing grew lighter, thinner, like a candle burning low. "Maggie," Ethan said softly, stepping closer. "Do you need anything? Water? A pillow?" She gave a small shake of her head. "Just this," she whispered, curling her fingers deeper into Bruno's fur. "I'm not afraid. Not anymore." Bruno lifted his head, leaning into her hand with a soft, wavering sound that broke every heart in the room. Dr. Reyes put a hand over her mouth. "He knows," she whispered. "He absolutely knows." The sanctuary grew quieter, as though every animal sensed it too. The wind outside slowed. Even the birds perched silently on the branches nearest the veterinary wing. Finally, with the softest sigh, Maggie whispered, "Thank you for waiting for me." Her eyes fluttered closed. Her chest rose once more, slowly, gently, peacefully, then stilled. Ethan bowed his head, tears sliding down his face. Dr. Reyes turned away, shoulders trembling. Bruno froze. He lifted his head, sniffing the air, touching her cheek with his nose. Then he made a sound no one there would ever forget. A low, trembling cry, full of sorrow so raw it pierced the heart. He pressed his head tight against her chest, as if searching for a breath that would not return. "Let him stay," Dr. Reyes whispered through tears. "Don't touch him. Let him grieve." They stepped back. Bruno lay beside her for hours, sometimes touching her cheek, sometimes licking her hand gently, as though coaxing her awake. Other times simply resting his head on her chest, feeling the silence where her heartbeat used to be. No one disturbed him. No one dared. As evening fell, stars blinking awake in the deep blue sky, Bruno finally stood. His legs trembled under him. He looked at Maggie one last time, long, heartbreaking, knowing. Then he lowered his head and touched her hand gently with his nose. A final goodbye. He walked toward the corner of the room closest to her, curled himself tightly on the floor, and closed his eyes. He never opened them again. Early contact staff found him still and peaceful, his body resting in the same direction as hers, like he had positioned himself to keep watch until his own tired heart gave out. Dr. Reyes later recorded the cause as kidney failure, but everyone who had witnessed the bond between Bruno and Maggie understood the truth. He died of a broken heart. The sanctuary held a memorial for them both, quiet and intimate. On a simple wooden plaque hung beside the Bobcat habitat, the staff engraved their names forever: Margaret Maggie, Coleman, and Bruno the Bobcat. Two souls reunited at the end, two hearts that remembered what time tried to erase. Visitors stopped to read the plaque, often leaving flowers, handwritten notes, or small drawings. Someone donated a warm blanket embroidered with the words, "Love Never Ends." A wildlife advocacy group shared a story about them, talking about the powerful bonds in wildlife rescue, senior care, and emotional support animals, using their story to inspire better care for both humans and animals in their final years. But no tribute captured the truth better than the silent memory of that day. The day a scarred, aging bobcat broke free, sprinted through chaos, and charged not to kill, but to return to the only person he ever trusted, the only person he ever loved. And what happened next silenced everyone. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, I'd love to hear from you. You don't need to write anything long, just leave a simple 1 or 0 in the comments so I know you were here with us. Every little mark you leave helps keep these stories alive. And if you'd like to walk with me through more incredible moments between humans and wildlife, please consider subscribing. There are many more stories ahead, some heartwarming, some unbelievable, all worth sharing. Thank you for being here today. I hope to see you again in the next story.